Today, I want to talk about something that feels a little bigger than just one successful movie. The Amazing Digital Circus, The Last Act, hit theaters. It didn't just do pretty well for a YouTube cartoon. It did the kind of numbers that should make the entire animation industry stop and pay attention. This wasn't Disney, it wasn't Pixar, and it wasn't DreamWorks. This was not a decades-old theatrical franchise being pushed by a massive studio machine. This was a creator-led, internet-native, independent animated series from Glitch Productions that started on YouTube, built a massive audience online, expanded to Netflix without giving up its identity, and brought that audience into actual movie theaters. And that is why I think The Amazing Digital Circus may be one of the clearest signs yet that independent animation is no longer just living outside the Hollywood bubble. It is starting to compete with it. Not necessarily budget for budget, not in the sense that every indie animator suddenly has Pixar level resources, but in terms of audience passion, cultural footprint, merchandise, theatrical demand, and direct connection to fans. The needle has been moved, and The Amazing Digital Circus is proof. The first reason that matters is simple. The box office proved the audience was real. The Amazing Digital Circus, The Last Act, made around 12 million over the traditional opening weekend and over 20 million across its first 4 days. It eventually finished around 25 million domestically and over 36 million worldwide. Because this wasn't a standard animated feature where the whole marketing pitch was, come discover this new movie. This was more along the lines of, the finale of this thing you already love is coming to theaters first. Do you want to experience it with other fans? And people said yes. That matters because Hollywood has spent years asking, how do we get people back into theaters? And a lot of the answer has been nostalgia, sequels, superheroes, horror, and giant brands. But Digital Circus suggests another answer. Maybe people will go to the theaters when the thing is on screen, feels like a real community event. Maybe they will show up when the audience feels ownership. Maybe they'll show up when they're not being sold a corporate product, but invited into shared fandom moment. And that is why this is not just another box office story. It's an audience behavior story. One comparison I think is really interesting is the 2025 SpongeBob movie, Search for SquarePants. That movie opened to around 15.6 million from over 3,500 theaters. The Amazing Digital Circus opened in the same general neighborhood for about 2,200 theaters. So yes, SpongeBob opened higher, but SpongeBob is also one of the most recognizable animated brands in the last 25 years. Backed by Paramount and Nickelodeon. The Digital Circus was a YouTube board indie series releasing a feature-length finale. That comparison doesn't mean Digital Circus is bigger than SpongeBob, but what it does mean is that the gap between internet-native animation and traditional studio animation is not as wide as it used to be. And that's a big deal. The second reason I feel like The Amazing Digital Circus pushes the needle is that it proves fandom itself can become infrastructure. In the old model, a creator usually needed the studio first. You need the studio to fund you. You need the studio to market you. You need the studio to get you distribution. You need the studio to put you in front of people. But Digital Circus showed a different path. First, you can build the audience directly. Then the audience becomes the leverage. The show launched on YouTube. It became a viral phenomenon. Fans made edits, memes, fan arts, theories, reaction videos, cosplay, analysis videos, and all the things that turn a show from content into culture. Then, once the fan base was impossible to ignore, the series could expand outwards. Netflix didn't just make The Amazing Digital Circus popular, the audience did. Theaters did not make The Amazing Digital Circus relevant, the audience did. Merchandise didn't create the fandom created the demand for the merchandise. For independent animators, this is incredibly important because it means the audience relationship is not just promotional, it's part of the business model. The fans are not just viewers, they are signal boosters. They are community builders. They are the proof of concept. And when enough people care loudly enough, traditional companies have to notice. That's what I mean when I say fandom has become infrastructure. A studio has infrastructure, marketing teams, distribution, licensing departments, production pipelines. But an internet native creator has a different kind of infrastructure. Subscribers, Discord communities, fan artists, reaction channels, meme circulation, algorithmic movement, and a global word of mouth. That may sound less formal, but it can be incredibly powerful. The Amazing Digital Circus took that online infrastructure and converted it into theatrical demand. That is the part Hollywood should be studying. The third reason is the matter that Glitch Production did not appear to lose the center of the property as it got bigger. This is one of the most important pieces to the whole story. When an independent animated show becomes successful, the usual fear is that a streamer or studio comes in, buys it, changes it, waters it down, controls the schedule, owns the IP, and turns the original creator into one voice in as much a bigger corporate machine. But with the Amazing Digital Circus, the model seemed different. The show remained on YouTube first. The Netflix deal was a licensing agreement, not a full surrender of the property. That's a big deal, because it suggests a healthier model for indie animation scaling up. Instead of just, please save us Hollywood, the energy is closer to, we already built something valuable, and now we can partner from a position of strength. That distinction matters, because the dream for independent animation should not just be get picked up. The dream should be sustainability without losing what made work special in the first place. The Amazing Digital Circus feels like a case study in that. It didn't just become successful by pretending to be a studio cartoon. It became successful because it had a specific voice, specific designs, specific themes, and a specific weirdness that connected to people. So the lesson here is not indie animators should make things more like mainstream animation. The lesson is the opposite. The show looks strange, the premise is dark, the humor can be surreal. The characters feel memeable and tragic at the same time. The aesthetic feels like early internet CG, mascot horror, theater kid anxiety, digital surrealism, and existential dread, all thrown onto one colorful circus tent. That's not a committee-friendly sentence. And that's exactly why it worked. Another reason Digital Circus matters is that it understands how modern audiences consume animation. Back when I started on YouTube around 2010, the path for independent animation felt a lot narrower. You could upload shorts, you could hope to build a fan base, you could maybe run a Kickstarter, you could maybe get noticed by a small producer or distributor. There were exceptions, obviously. There were major web animated success stories. There was crowdfunding breakthroughs like Dick Figures the Movie and Bee and Puppy Cat. But for most creators, the path for YouTube animation to mainstream legitimacy felt blurry. Now the landscape is different. Creators have better tools. Audiences are more used to watching long-form animation online. Merch stores are easier to build. Global fandoms form faster. Social media turns characters into symbols. Streaming platforms are more willing to license internet-native hits. Theaters are more open to event releases where demand is already visible. This is a completely different ecosystem. And the Amazing Digital Circus is one of the best examples of that. It doesn't rely on one magical door opening. It stacked multiple lanes together. YouTube for reach, Netflix for broader visibility, merch for monetization, fan culture for circulation, theaters for event status, international dubbing, and global distribution for scale. And that's where I think independent animation has an advantage over some studio animation. Major studios often have to spend millions trying to manufacture cultural relevance. Digital Circus had cultural relevancy before the theatrical release even happened. Theaters were not being asked to create demand from scratch, they were responding to demand that already existed. That's a major difference. The fifth reason this show feels culturally important is more emotional. The Amazing Digital Circus is about people trapped in a synthetic world, trying to hold on identity, connection, sanity, and meaning while being surrounded by absurdity and artificial control. To be fair, I think that premise resonates pretty well. We live so much of our lives online. Younger audiences especially are growing up inside algorithmic spaces, digital personas, AI anxiety, social media performance, fandom communities, and constant overstimulation. So when Digital Circus presents characters trapped in a colorful digital nightmare, it may look silly on the surface, but emotionally it taps into something real. And then the theatrical release adds another layer. A show about being trapped in a digital space brought fans out of their digital spaces and into a physical theater together. That's kind of poetic. The online fandom became an offline event, and this is one of the reasons why I think this will be remembered as more than just a successful finale. It marked a moment where independent animation crossed over from something you watch online to something you experience in public with people. That's a big cultural shift. And for indie animators, that should be inspiring. The goal for us is to use internet as a launch pad. YouTube isn't just a place to dump work anymore. It can be the first stage of a much bigger ecosystem. Now I do want to be careful. The Amazing Digital Circus is an extreme case. It had massive viewership, a passionate fan base, strong character branding, a clear finale event, and a distributor like Fathom that specializes in event cinema. So the takeaway should not be anyone can upload a cartoon and make 30 million. That would be unrealistic. The takeaway is more specific. If an indie animated project builds a large enough direct audience, retains enough control of its brand, creates character people wants to emotionally invest in, and gives fans a reason to show up together, then traditional distribution becomes more possible than it used to be. That's the needle moving. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible in ways that feel much more visible than it did 10 or 15 years later. That's the needle moving. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible in a way that feels much more visible than it did 10 or 15 years ago. And that's why I think the Amazing Digital Circus matters. So when I look at the Amazing Digital Circus, the last act, I don't just see a successful theatrical event. I see a market signal. I see a proof that independent animation can build global fandoms without waiting for permission. I see proof that YouTube animation is no longer automatically treated as a lower tier than studio animation. I see proof that creator owned or creator led IP can enter Netflix, merchandise, and theaters without necessarily losing its identity. And I see proof that audiences are hungry for animation that feels weird, specific, emotional, and internet native. That's what makes this so exciting. Because for years, independent animators had to look at Hollywood as the place where legitimacy happens. But now, maybe legitimacy can start online. Maybe the audience can come first. Maybe Hollywood doesn't have to be the gatekeeper. Maybe it can be one of the partners that shows up after the creators and fans have already built a foundation. That's the real impact of the Amazing Digital Circus. It didn't just prove that an indie animated series could be popular. It proved that an indie animated series could become an event. And if more creators, distributors, and theaters learn from this, we may be entering a new era where independent animation does not have to ask for permission to matter. It can build its own circus. And apparently, people are going to buy the tickets. But I want to know what you think. I mean, this wasn't a full review of the film. I do have my thoughts on it, and I would like to share it in the future. Do you think that the Amazing Digital Circus is a turning point for independent animation, or is it too unique to be copied? Or would you like to see me actually do a review of this film? Let me know in the comments. And if you like animation commentary, animation news, and creator driven products, subscribe for more. Thank you.